Generic greetings and welcome to Science Insanity. Today we are going to be doing a lore primer for the Battlestar Galactica universe, one of my favorite science fiction universes, and the one I consider to have the single greatest science fiction ship designs ever. They are awesome chonkers that blast the shit out of each other across the void, and by God, I will be trying my hardest to get you to fall in love with it as well. Along for the journey today of lore discovery and turbo nerd garbage is Steve, my lovable assistant that knows absolutely nothing about science fiction, and we will be learning him a thing or two. You want to introduce yourself, Steve?
Hello.
That's Steve. Yeah, Steve here. That's the best you're going to get out of him. We're going to be like 500 episodes in. The best you're getting is a hello.
Same greeting.
Same greeting every time. The exact same cadence as well. It's almost like I'm playing you on loop and you're not actually real.
Little known fact, we never record these intros anymore.
Oh my god. So this is actually the second time we are recording this, so Steve is probably going to know quite a bit more than one would normally expect, mostly because the first time we tried to record it, we ran into a time crunch, had to munch a whole bunch of stuff off the video, and I really didn't like how it turned out. So here we are for round 2. And since you know quite a bit, Steve, would you like to take at least a wild stab in the dark about what we're going to start talking about?
I'm going to say the Battlestar itself.
Incorrect. You are stupid and wrong. Oh no, what we're gonna start with, we are gonna start with the early lore and history of humanity, because I realized we didn't actually explain.
We don't need that.
Oh yeah, we do. We didn't explain
the good stuff.
Oh my god, the good stuff will come later, don't worry. We need to explain it though, because we didn't in the first time, and I realized it made no fucking sense about where anything came from. So we're okay. Here's the stop talking. Here's the synopsis. All right. We're going to talk about the origins of man in the setting. We're going to talk about the founding of the 12 colonies, where the Cylons came from. Then we're going to move on to how technology developed, get into all the nitty-gritty, the giant ships, the guns, all of the fancy things that explode. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about the fall of humanity and what led into the modern television series about all the rest of the humans trying to skedaddle-skadoodle the hell away from all of the toasters on their ass. Because heavens knows that running from a Doomba is probably the scariest thing you can do. And then after that, there's just going to be a few random sci-fi facts and neat stuff that I want to go over, because there's a lot of really cool things in this universe, and then we're going to be done. That went by way smoother than I thought it was. God damn, Canadian, you're so fucking good at this.
It's almost like it's your job or something.
Voice acting and podcasting is not my job. It's just I'm a professional hobbyist. So we're going to start with the homeworld of humanity, at least all we know of the homeworld of humanity. You see, Battlestar Galactica is one of those settings where nobody actually really knows when history quote-unquote began. Kobol, the world that humans supposedly evolved on, is absolutely ancient, and even back on that world, a whole lot of humanity had creation myths that talked about people coming from the stars, and that Kobol may not actually have been where humans came from. And there's a lot of this just absolute mystery about where the hell people are from. You know, to even the ridiculous degree that Earth, like canonical real-life Earth, is actually the homeworld of part of humanity in this setting, but not all of it. So it's absolute chaos, but, you know, it's fine. We'll assume Kobol is where humanity came from.
We love chaos here.
Oh yeah, chaos is wonderful. I mean, insanity is, you know, more preferable. Science insanity. You know, God, I forced that joke so hard. It's not even funny.
Just a little bit.
Just a little. I'm reaching. I'm so tired.
Don't worry, no one will notice.
No one will notice, it's fine. As humanity continued to evolve, it followed the normal path that humans do. Monkey see, monkey do, lift rock, bash other monkeys' brain in with rock, and eventually we managed to fling ourselves into the stars and begin exploiting our local solar system. However, they continued to advance until humanity developed artificial intelligence. The development got so advanced that they were creating biological artificial intelligence that were fundamentally indistinguishable from humans, other than they couldn't reproduce, and they were still technically beholden to programming. You know, you can crash them by giving them computer viruses and stuff. And this did not go over well at all. You see, they developed essentially people that were fully sentient and very, very intelligent, being AI, and then they basically consign them to slaves, doing all of the manual labor, all of the grunt work, fighting and dying in wars, and being put in generally horrible conditions.
Nothing could ever go wrong.
Oh, absolutely not. The AI pulled a space Haiti, and there was a colossal slave revolt that absolutely devastated humanity. However, the biological AI weren't quite capable of actually beating mankind, so they stole whatever they could and dipped off into space, stealing any military or civilian vessels that they could get their hands on, and essentially scrubbing all data of their existence from pretty much everything that they could, and just fled as far away into space as they can. And by far away into space, I mean like they crossed like a quarter of the Milky Way galaxy to GTFO. They were gone. And they were actually the ones that found Earth and settled upon it. And there, they continued to advance until they were so biologically advanced and indistinguishable from real creatures that they could biologically reproduce by doing the nasty. And they became the 13th tribe, or 13th colony, whatever, of mankind on Earth, while the other 12 stayed behind on Kobol, at least temporarily. Kind of freakish, you know? I mean, we're already setting up the cycles of history, and we're literally only like 5 minutes in. Regardless, though, it is a really good story, but it does get kind of a little bit repetitive, where you're like, man, I wonder what's going to happen to Johnny the AI. Oh, what's that? He revolted and killed his biological overlords, then became a human? Strange, whatever. Back on Kobol, the 12 tribes of humanity were experiencing an unknown but absolutely cataclysmic tragedy. It's completely unknown whether or not this was natural, something like an asteroid slamming into the planet, maybe there was some massive chain of volcanic eruptions, maybe the fleeing Cylons and biological AI destroyed the planet as they left. Nobody really knows. All they know is that decades later, something caused Kobol to become uninhabitable, and the 12 tribes fled to find a new home as well, eventually finding a cluster of star systems with 12 habitable worlds orbiting 4 stars. Funny how that works out, huh? 12 for 12. You know, science fiction author, I can see your hand moving. Please, attempt to be a little less obvious about it. They would come to dub these star systems the Cyrannus Cluster, or the 4 stars individually known as Helios Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, because they all orbited so close to each other in the same nebula that they were widely considered to be the same star system. As the 12 refugee tribes of humanity began to settle, they named each of their worlds after their tribes. However, it wasn't all at once, like they didn't all spread out. They basically all settled on one world, and as political differences and as the desire to basically be independent grew over time once they had established themselves, the 12 colonies began cropping up around the 4 star systems, right? Brief information, get ready for like a lightning round, because there's fucking 12 of them. We gotta go, okay? Ready? On the count of 3? 3, 2, 1. Number 1, Arelon, the colony's breadbasket. A massive planet, rolling hills, not much else. Basically just agricultural mining supports the other colonies. It is dirt poor, and everybody on it is a dirt farmer. So, blunt, hardworking, incredibly rude. Next, Aquaria, ice colony. This is Space Antarctica. It was the last one to be officially settled, and it is piss cold. The only people that live on it is a research colony, and eventually it became a tourist destination where people go to ski and snowboard and probably freeze to death in the tundra. Next up, Canceron, named after the Cancer tribe. Very unfortunate name. Also, the largest democracy, and that is an insult, because with the biggest population of 6.7 billion people, it also has the largest manpower reserve, and it is extremely dysfunctional. If you're wondering how could a democracy work with 6.7 billion people voting, the answer is it doesn't. Next up, Caprica, originally a backwater world. Caprica over time became the culture and technological heart of humanity, responsible for much of human development in the Cyrannus cluster. Also, they made the Cylons, and they're a bunch of pretentious dicks who think they're better than everyone else. Geminon, the first colony, the one that everyone landed on. Not much else. It's middling in every other way, and people tend to forget about it all the time except for vague religious reasons. Leonis, one of the first 2 empires of humanity. Growing faster and farther than any of the other early colonies, Leonis became a pseudo-empire, colonized and controlled several smaller worlds and spreading its culture and law to them in all the subtlety of the British Empire, for its own benefit, of course. They are also raging assholes. That leads us to the second empire that they fought against, Virgon. Similarly to Leonis, Virgon emerged as an early empire and got its industry and manpower up and running before any of its other competitors and created or conquered several other colonies within the Cyrannus cluster. Unlike Leonis though, Virgon was, and still is in the modern day, a kingdom ruled by a hereditary dynasty, and legend has it that the monarchs are raging incompetents and generally only exist in their palaces kept there by their guards for the fear that they'll go out in public and fuck something up. Next up, Libran. The Galactic Courts. Underdeveloped and backwards most of its existence, Libran stayed neutral and held good relations with all of the other colonies and empires. So when the Articles of Colonization were signed and humanity united, they became the home of the colonial courts. Basically, the space UN with actual legal power to come by and kick your dick in if you break the law. Oh my god, I need to take a breath because we still have so many more to go. We're only halfway through. Pycon, unremarkable other than it's a world of mostly water and has some giga-big shipyards in orbit around it. But those were built by the United Colonies, not Pycon. Nothing else to talk about. Probably a really, really good fishing industry. Sagittaron, they exist to be wrong and stupid. Everyone is racist against them and they deserve it. They were originally like Puritans leaving to find a more religious homeland from their super religious homeland, and they're about as annoying. They don't believe in things like military service during a war of extinction against sentient toasters, religious tolerance to anyone other than themselves, which includes murdering everyone that's not themselves, or medicine. They don't believe in medicine. They're often called walking plague blankets because guess what they tended to spread a lot of whenever they moved around the other colonies. After them, Scorpia, the colony's playground. This is space Vegas, and also because it was colonized, quote-unquote, many, many times. And in the current day, it's basically a absolute cesspit of alcohol, drugs, rock and roll, and crime. Hooray! It also has some colossal shipyards built in orbit because its planet has rings that are stupid mineral rich, so, you know, living off that Saudi oil money. Tauron, the last one, there we go. A relatively average world of subsistence farmers and hardy live-off-the-land people. It similarly endured the horrors of colonization, but managed to free itself during a revolt known as Our Day by the people of Tauron. Whose day? No idea. Afterwards, a massive famine was brought about as trade was immediately halted and they couldn't feed themselves. They became known as dirt eaters thereafter as an almost racial slur because of their abject poverty and the fact that many of them would actually eat dirt. So, there we go. Oh my god, the 12 colonies. That was a disaster. I think I burned through those in like 5 minutes. That's more than one colony every 30 seconds. Damn, that was fast.
I'm gonna tell you, I retained about 2%, maybe.
The only one I would expect you to remember is Cancer because, you know, funny name. Oh, by the way, is it abundantly obvious that they're named after like the astrology signs and stuff?
Just a little bit. I mean, it's not blatantly obvious. I mean, as long as you don't read the name.
As long as you don't read the name, it's not obvious, yeah. Oh my god, man. This universe wears its heart on its sleeve. Like the hand of the writer is just right there in your face all the time. Regardless though, those were the 12 colonies of humanity. To all the viewers, feel free to go back and watch that at like half playback speed because man, we don't have time to cover all 12. Like I was saying, those are the 12 colonies of humanity. And after the Cylon Rebellion came to be known as the United Colonies of Cobol under colonial command. This deal basically meant that each world would retain self-governance and cultural independence because many of them hated each other, but they would concede control of its military, industry, judicial matters, and off-world territories, as well as pretty much all of their space to colonial command in order to better coordinate all of humanity's industrial and military might against the Cylons. Originally, and for the most part, like I mentioned, none of the bigger colonies were particularly happy about the deal, but it became clear relatively quickly that alone they would be outmaneuvered and annihilated by the Cylons, and so they simply sucked it up and fell in line to make sure that the Roombas and Toasters couldn't burn down their house and dox their homework folder to the entire internet. And speaking of, let's talk briefly about the Toasters, because it's not going to make sense explaining anything else unless we talk about them. First, Cylon, the name, Cylon. This is actually an acronym. It stands for Cybernetic Lifeform Node. Early on in the history of the Cylons, they were originally humanoid military drones, no more advanced than what you could probably program today if you were really, really determined to add a rifle on the side of some, MIT robot that can barely stand. Eventually, more advanced programming gave Cylons the ability to learn and adapt, but they were still extraordinarily dumb. Like, unable to tell the difference between a hostile and a friendly if you change the shirt color of one of them levels of dumb.
Hey man, that thing applies to some humans too. I mean,
Really? I've never understood
yes.
that. I'm a face person. I can remember someone's face for years, but I'll forget their name, I'll forget everything about them, whatever. But if I see their face, I'm like, I know that person. I've seen them before. Are there
Well,
actually...
You don't know everyone that you're fighting with and against. I mean...
You know what? To be fair, AI are like, does this picture have a traffic cone in it? And it's just like a picture of a carrot. All right, fair enough. I can see how AI would get confused about that. However, you know, continuing on, the real advancement for the Cylons came from the head scientist's daughter. You see, the daughter was an artist/computer programmer, and a brilliant one at that. Strange choice of professions, but it is what it is. The daughter's work was stolen by the head researcher and used to upgrade the Cylons' AI, basically training them to act more like a human being and to understand more abstract concepts to better help them engage with, you know, anything from terrorists to full-on military conflicts. The daughter was absolutely not happy about this and began trying to get her work back. However, this never came to be. There were a large number of fanatical and highly anti-AI terrorist and fundamentalist groups all across the colonies that wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Cylons. They viewed them as a mix of existential threat to human survival, which they would become.
They knew what's up, man. They were ahead of the curve.
Or they viewed them as an affront to God, and, you know, they tried to stop it as best they could. And so, a suicide bomber blew up the daughter and the head, and not the head researcher, but the head researcher's wife and most of the building that they were in, right? And this is where truly the tragedy of the Cylons really come from. You see, they could never make them smart enough to be considered actual AI. They were at best relatively flexible computer programs. When the daughter was killed, however, upon looking through much of her stuff, he discovered that the daughter had created a functional copy of her brain, basically finding a way to create an almost perfect replica of her human consciousness that she named after herself. The intention was most likely something relatively benign or even good, at least that's what the lore tells us. However, the father would, what I can only describe, commit unspeakable torture upon what was a digitized version of his daughter, right? He would take this copy and he would systematically strip away everything that made it human, removing everything from memories to emotions to feelings to even concepts of things like love or loyalty or the fun memories that they had as a kid. It would strip away everything that could even identify it as what it used to be, removing its ability to understand its own name, to even understand the concept of a name, removing everything except the ability to adapt and to think, creating essentially a human-level intelligence with absolutely no knowledge of the world that would do whatever its programming told it to do. However, this
seems like a good decision to make to me.
Oh, it was a horrible decision, and when you really think about it, that is fucking terrifying. Because keep in mind, this copy of the scientist's daughter was conscious, like it was alive. For all intents and purposes, it was a real person just without a body, so the fact that they did this is absolutely horrifying. And I guess luckily for the Cylons, but unluckily for the rest of humanity, he did not fully succeed. There was a number of things left in the programming that he had never considered to remove or that he never even considered were there. One of them being that his daughter, who never truly spoke about her faith and never openly or actively engaged with it, was an extremely religious person, although in a very personal way, never really sharing, not one of those soapbox preachers kind of thing. And this was going to turn in to a very, very bad thing, because when the only thing that most Cylons are programmed to do is kill, and the only lingering aspect of humanity is religious zealotry, you are going to run into a lot of problems down the line.
Fucking crusades, baby. Let's go.
Oh yeah, we are not going to have fun with this, baby. Not at all. Early on though, the Cylons were not really capable of doing anything. They weren't intelligent enough to really fight back, to really understand what was happening, and that's because of the node designation in Cylon. Each one was a linked computer system that could interact with and amplify each other. All of them are individually sentient and AI, but when you put them together, they basically act like a supercomputer. As Cylons began proliferating around the colonies, the scientists and manufacturers and military began to notice that, hey, they were performing above what the specs said that they would. They began to work better as a team. They began to problem solve faster, more efficiently. They began to work more fluidly. In many cases, they would even begin to mimic or appear to mimic human emotion, speech, and action patterns. Cylons became so prevalent that they were used as like maids. They were used as butlers, as garbage men. They were used to mine resources, to fight wars. They were used for construction and labor, and even in many cases, medical applications and farming and stuff. Like literally everything across all 12 of the colonies. And so people began to get uneasy about the Cylons, and that unease was proved correct when a few years later they hit a sort of critical mass, and all of them, almost universally at the same time across all 12 colonies, began a massive slave revolt. Like every single one of them. At the same time that the military models began gunning down soldiers on military bases and trying to commandeer equipment like fighters and tanks and ships, all of the civilian models began as well. Medical droids would start slicing open patients and doctors, garbage men would be running down people with their trucks. And I imagine somewhere in there, a Cylon farmer was chasing people with a combine across a field, and I just...
That's a beautiful image.
Something about that is just so perfect to me, and I love thinking about it. So the Cylon rebellion began in earnest. I would also like to say, I kind of skipped over it here because I'm flying through the script, but one of the first uses of the Cylons, I probably should have talked about this earlier, but one of the first uses where they were ever deployed was military variants to fight that terrorist group that originally blew up the facility where they were being developed. And what had happened is more suicide bombers basically took a massive government building hostage and were sitting in it with a whole bunch of suicide bombs, right? They were freezing the local government infrastructure for the whole area, and there was no way to get them out of this building without sending people in to deal with them, and that's what the bombers wanted. They wanted to cause as much death as possible. Instead, they just sent in the Cylons, because who cares? Either the suicide bombers blow themselves up for nothing and only damage the infrastructure, or they surrender because, the Cylons were mercilessly effective. The kind of mercilessly effective that they would walk around a corner into a room and instantly blast the 4 people hiding in the 4 different corners. Like, they were incredibly good at what they were doing. But moving on from that...
They're computers.
Yeah, they're in many ways, like... So, while this revolution was incredibly bloody, even several nuclear strikes happening from both sides as Cylons would gain control of some nuclear weapons and humans would nuke cities that were entirely depopulated and taken over by the robots, the Cylons had no way of winning this war. While many of them had weapons, rarely were they able to get their hands on anything, like nukes in large enough quantities to actually make this a fight. And much of humanity caught on quickly and shut their destructive defensive systems off, instead deciding to resort to good old force multipliers. Guns and tanks and dumbfire missiles and bombs that are just as effective as anything the Cylons had their hands on, and they would simply turn off or lock down all of the more advanced systems and not let the robots get a chance to get a hold of them. The Cylons, realizing how absolutely fucked they were in a straight-up fight, and also realizing that the smaller and poorer colonies had very few to no Cylons on them, so they could recover or they could serve as staging grounds for the rest of humanity, decided to flee from human space rather than be annihilated, since humanity could most likely survive the Cylon storm and hit back hard enough to cripple their infant species. In order to flee, they did horrible AI things, hacking into ships and anything else they could get their hands on, and using the prevalence of networked computers to steal a vast fleet of civilian ships, along with quite a few military vessels, but only initially, because the colonies wised up to that pretty fast and stopped accepting random emails from people that weren't verified, so the Cylons didn't have too much success in stealing military vessels.
Damn, so you're telling me that good old Nigerian prince was still working in that time?
I mean, hell, the Cylons were so universal, they literally replaced the Nigerian prince with a Cylon doing the same thing. Like, goddamn. Even royalty wasn't safe from being replaced by machines, man. Automation has gone too far. However, you may be wondering, they sure as shit couldn't get the crew to kindly disembark, so the Cylons...
They were simply assimilated.
No, nothing like that, okay? This is not the Borg from Star Trek. The Cylons kindly got them to unkindly disembark by opening all of the doors. All of them. Turns out, space can give the big suck better than even the most premium of ethos and OnlyFans creators. The Cylons basically just vented every person out into space, and if the body didn't get sucked out into the great big empty, then I assume a Cylon-made model would come over and kindly shove it out the airlock before closing the door again.
Cylon's kind of sus, solemn venting.
Not particularly the kindest way to go, but, you know, it is what it is. So the Cylons depressurized most of these ships outright, and when the crews couldn't be vented into space, they simply killed them or literally starved them to death by just welding them into whatever compartments that they were stuck in. And keep in mind, like I said several times, the Cylons are true AI, genuinely, so their physical bodies mean absolutely nothing to them. They do like their physical bodies, and part of their religious mantra is perfecting their form so that they can ascend with the one true God. I'm not making that up, that's actual Cylon faith right there.
Sounds a lot like that assimilation thing.
Regardless, though, like I was trying to say, you know, they didn't really care about their physical forms. So in many cases, you know, the Cylons would simply transfer their code to a commandeered vessel and fry their humanoid body before dipping out into the ass end of nowhere. Many Cylons that couldn't do this and tried to steal grounded or docked ships instead, and this went significantly less well, but they still saw limited success. By the end of the rebellion, almost every Cylon had either escaped or were outright destroyed. There were no prisoners taken, or any of them left behind managed to survive. It was essentially full-on capital G word Armenian level of unaliving robots here. The remaining Cylons took whatever infrastructure and industrial vessels that they had and jumped into unknown space. The first Cylon War actually goes cold for a few years here, as while the Colonials still had a massive fleet of warships that could chase them down and destroy them, the chaos of the rebellion meant that literally everything in society was absolutely borked. Everything from power generation to manufacturing to garbage pickup and hell, even shipping food and fuel between the colonies essentially ground to a stop. So the colonial fleet was finding it very hard to get food, fuel, and ammunition to do much of anything, while the colonies were fighting amongst each other as famine and lack of resources began to set in en masse. Now, this wouldn't cripple humanity, not even close. They bounced back relatively quickly, as Cylons hadn't been around for too long, only a few decades by this point, and much of the infrastructure and the professionals that were replaced by the Cylons were still around. But this year to a year and a half of just absolute chaos was enough time for the Cylons to escape and begin setting up their own infant industry and shipbuilding practices to try to defend themselves. And, you know, this is a wonderful time to briefly segue into the technology of Battlestar Galactica, because while the Cylons left with colonial technology, and they both started from the exact same starting line, in terms of their ships and their designs and their weapons and stuff, they each developed vastly different from one another, playing into their strengths and into the enemy's weaknesses. You see, while we could talk about the first Cylon War, the Ghost Fleet Offensive, or the Jupiter-class Battlestar, we won't, because there's a shitload to cover, and also because those topics sound badass and keep the viewer wanting more for future episodes. We will cover how they developed by the end of the First Cylon War and the beginning of the Second. A lot of their early war technology was an evolution of their colonial counterparts, mostly because they jacked their shit and just made it better since that's all they had. They would take colonial vessels, they would up-armor them, they would put bigger engines on them, they would put bigger guns on them, and they would upgrade the computer systems, making them overall outright better because, well, they could. They didn't need to worry about things like an atmosphere, life support, food and water storage, or literally any of the other things you need to keep a human alive.
Amazing what not having a life support system does for a man.
I know, man. Don't you wish that you were like a pilot from Ace Combat? You just don't have blood and your body is made of gelatin. You can pull the most ridiculous stunts and turns ever. However, as things continued to advance, the Cylons began to move away from that because, they simply couldn't keep up industry-wise with the Colonials. The Cylons basically had to scrape together whatever they could using mining ships, industrial platforms, and all of that stuff, while trying to cobble together a real industrial base at the same time that they were trying to produce warships so that they weren't simply exterminated by the vengeful colonies. And in order to get around this, they began relying extremely heavily on missiles and on swarm tactics using drones and fighters, because they could mass produce those far easier than the Colonials could mass produce ships, but they could also coordinate them far better because, they're AI, than any human computer system ever, could hope to, and they could overwhelm the Colonials' point defenses. They also, like I mentioned, started using swarms of fighter craft called raiders in order to overwhelm Colonial defenses, but more specifically, in order to cripple their point defense systems. Classic Cylon strategy at this point would basically be to just spam fighters at them, try to blow up their guns and cripple their fighter escorts, and then pound the Colonial fleet with missiles from well outside of conventional engagement distance until there was just nothing left, battering them to pieces with long-range missiles, or hell, even nukes, because the Cylons very rapidly realized, when in doubt, drop the sun on them. Never fails. So, I also mentioned that they were very good at electronic warfare, and that's because, well, they could simply brute force...
Moment.
Yeah, AI moment. They could brute force their way through pretty much any firewall. NordVPN ain't doing shit to protect you from these guys, alright? And they were also capable of spreading through almost any kind of interlinked computer system. I'm not talking like, oh, there's a central computer mainframe that runs anything and they manage to get in there. No. If there are two computers on the ship and they can communicate with each other, like, at all, the Cylons are capable of hacking their way through it. If anyone has, like, a cell phone or whatever, or a data pad that they can open doors or turn on lights with, the Cylons can basically access the entire ship if they hack that. So they were very spooky early on, and had a habit of either turning the guns and engines of enemy ships off, or just outright venting the atmosphere if they got access to the life support systems. Very, very spooky.
Did we go back to flashing lights and signal flags, or?
Yeah, actually, we did. I'll get into that a little bit later, but I kind of imagine that even though the Cylon, like every single Cylon ship is an AI, right? I kind of imagine that the hacking isn't like what you see in a lot of movies where they're like, manipulating some 3D cube. I've always imagined that Cylon hacking is kind of like, you get a spam email or you get like a phone call, and the moment someone answers it, the Cylon opens up like a billion instances of Bonzi Buddy on the ship's computer and just bricks the whole system instantly.
I think it would be better if it was the thing from Jurassic Park. You didn't say the magic word.
Oh my god, that would be so funny. That, you know what? That's a better visual than what I had for it. God damn it, Steve.
Yeah, you keep me around for something.
Yeah, I gotta keep you around for something. What do I pay you for, anyways? Come on, be funny. Give me the jokes here.
Wait, I'm getting paid.
In response to the AI being, well, ass-grabbing robots out to fuck with your insulin pump, the Colonials began regressing while progressing. And I know that reductive explanations like that are confusing, but hear me out. In order to avoid the Cylons' hacking attempts and mitigate damage, computer systems were all segregated from each other. Every airlock, every door, every fire control system for every gun was all unnetworked. They could all communicate, but it wasn't like actual electrical signals or computers sending instructions to each other and data and stuff. It was more like a dude getting a radio message telling him what buttons to press, or physically having components that would, send an electrical signal, and depending on the strength of the electrical signal, it would be a different output. The way that old World War II style battleships would have the gun director control all of the main turrets, that kind of thing, right? There weren't any actual computers, it was all mechanical solutions. I actually think that's really cool. Like, most sci-fi never even touches on that being possible, but it absolutely would be in space. The Colonials also began up-armoring everything to a laughable degree. If they couldn't rely on electronic countermeasures and having comprehensive stealth suites and stuff, because the Cylons could just completely ignore those, they were going to slap an absolutely stupid amount of armor onto everything. We are talking dozens of meters of armor in some places. These things were thick enough to withstand nuclear blasts at point blank range. That's how armored we're talking about colonial ships becoming. And the classic famous battle stars like the Jupiter class or the Mercury, goddamn, these things were absolute tanks, borderline indestructible in a one-on-one fight. Colonial ship designs became ever more focused on survivability and firepower over maneuverability and flexibility. Many of the human ships still used missiles, guns, electronic countermeasures, fighters, and other stuff, but they became almost entirely focused on giving and taking an absolute shit kicking. And since they couldn't counter Cylon missiles, they didn't tend to use those a whole lot either, and they also had a very limited supply of missiles. And the primary reason for this, aside from simply not having the resources most of the time, is that, complicated guided missiles would often just be yoinked by the Cylons. They would alter their programming and then just turn the missiles back around on whoever fired it. So dumbfire rockets were absolutely on the table, but the really complicated tracking missiles and stuff, normally not a thing that the Colonials would use.
Simply return back to having to break out the timer to aim torpedoes,
Oh, dude, I thought you were gonna give me the whole, return to sender fender bender thing, but you just had to.
Hey.
They also primarily focused on raw gunpowder, because the Cylons may be able to interdict and deal with missiles and a lot of electronic warfare stuff, but when you're fighting a shell flying at you at a appreciable percentage the speed of light the entire time while it is basically the size of a freight train, nothing short of a capital ship is going to be stopping that shell anytime soon, and it is going to fly through hundreds of raiders and little fighter craft without even so much as slowing down. So the Colonials really, really liked their main guns. And when I say that they were colossal, I really do mean it. They would actually fire train-sized projectiles from the main, center line mounted artillery cannons. These things were enormous. Sometimes they would even put flak shells in them, and you can imagine a flak shell the size of a train is...
Oh no, that's a lot of devastation.
In many cases, these shells would be powerful enough to outright destroy smaller Cylon ships in a single volley. But they were extremely hard to use because they were massive, they were slow, and they couldn't really use any advanced computer systems because, again, Cylons, to actually use them. So in a lot of cases, the people firing these guns would almost be firing by eye. There is physically a dude that sits in a little cockpit, right next to the gun barrel, and he is aiming the gun. The other thing that the Colonials used in order to counter the absolute spam of missiles and fighter craft was an unholy number of guns, everything that goes boom you could possibly imagine. And they strapped flak turrets and point defense cannons to literally every square inch of every ship that they could to put out enough flak to basically render missiles and fighter craft entirely pointless. One does not need a well-coordinated point defense system if every point you can be attacked from turns said attacker into Swiss cheese. I gotta find a picture. Battlestar Galactica's black screen. Oh my god. I forgot how powerful it actually looked. Okay, hang on. Good old Steve-O, good old friend of mine. Check this out. That's what when I say point defense screen, that's what I'm talking about. There is not a single inch of space in whatever direction these things are firing that is not filled with bullets. It is laughably over the top. You know, like, look at that and tell me that space lasers would be cooler. There's no way in hell.
I mean, it is basically an energy shield. I mean, zooming through that. I'm sorry, it's a lead shield.
Yeah, missiles and stuff will still get through that. It's just, it looks so much cooler than your Star Trek energy shield, where there's just a flash of blue and then nothing happens. And there's actual stakes as well, because the guns can miss. Like, here's another example of a Mercury-class Battlestar getting mogged by missiles, and its flak screen is bypassed and it gets obliterated. So, like,
maybe they should have had more turrets in the back. I mean, I saw
the problem is that the Mercury was running away in this scene. Battlestars face forward always. And that, speaking of that, actually segues really nicely into the difference in ship designs, right? Because while the weapon systems that they use are very different from one another, one focusing on overwhelming numbers and missiles, the other focusing on stalwart defense and raw firepower, the actual designs are super unique because of it. Let's start with the Cylons again, because why not? The toasters are just more entertaining to talk about. Cylon base stars. And yes, that does get confusing with battle stars. Don't worry, I mess them up a lot. You'll probably mess them up a lot as well, but it's cool. So there you go. That's an old Cylon base star, and they're named that because of the star-shaped pattern that they have on the upper and lower hull. Now, the whole point, this is like the classic Cylon design, by the way. You have like these rings that meet in the center, and it doesn't look like a spaceship, it looks more like a space station, and that's because of how the Cylons use them. That entire center bit, that trench that runs around the middle, right? That is where all of the Raider launch bays and the missile silos are. Because what the Cylon base stars do is they'll sit really far away and they'll angle their ship up or down a little bit towards the enemy so that they're presented with the armored top or bottom, and then the entire middle section can just vomit out fighters from every angle while at the same time vomiting missiles. And any incoming fire, like guns or artillery or whatever, can't get into those critical components in the center of the ship and knock out hangar bays or cause chain reactions with the missile tubes and stuff.
Cause any actual damage.
Yeah, you have to blast your way through all the heavily armored stuff on the top or bottom first, and I think that's actually really cool. That's a really interesting way of making a ship, because, in Battlestar Galactica, unlike a lot of science fiction, I'm looking at you, Star Wars, they actually keep in mind that in space, there is no, ocean you're fighting on. You can easily orient yourself in really different ways to kind of give you the best tactical advantage. And let's talk about the modern Cylon base star while we're here, because I showed you the old one, and this one is the new one. I gotta give you two images because it actually has two different modes. The one that I just posted is for in-atmosphere flight. So these things can actually go back into... Yeah, these things... Yeah, so what happens, these ones, they look like a star, right? The top and bottom halves, invert. But what happens is when they mirror themselves like this, they'll close in on each other and become a lot narrower and a lot more, aerodynamic, quote-unquote, and they can go into a planet's atmosphere. The way that this thing works, just like the other one, is close to that center spire is where all of the launch tubes are for its raiders and its fighter craft, right? That's where all the hangars are, that's where all the machine shops and maintenance bays and stuff are, and the reason that they're there is, once again, because the Cylon base star will angle that big upper or lower prong and basically use it as a shield to keep incoming fire away. But there is a fundamental difference. Whereas the other base star also had the missiles in the center, the modern base star does not. It has all of the missiles at the very tippy edges of the actual star prongs, and the reason for this is because in lore, they vomit out thousands of missiles, just disgusting amounts of missiles. And by positioning each of the prongs basically away from each other so that they're not in the way, they can fire the missiles with a lot more acceleration, a lot faster, out of all 6 of the prongs without needing to worry that they're going to interfere with each other or accidentally hit themselves. This base star has like anywhere from 450 to 900 Raider launch tubes. Not Raiders, launch
Pretty
tubes.
good.
Yeah, so theoretically, if it was absolutely full to the brim with fighters, this sucker could be launching thousands of fighters, and it could be doing it by the hundreds every minute. And for missiles, there's no concrete number of how many missiles it has, but I'm assuming thousands, because it has over 200 missile tubes, and they're described as being rapid fire and rapid reloading missile tubes. So this thing is probably designed to vomit out thousands of missiles. These new base stars are really flimsy. A couple good shells into almost any of the central structure, and this thing is completely out of commission. It'll be outright destroyed. The only defense it really has is that it's very fast for a ship of its size. It's got no known engines, it's got like some weird inertial drive deep in the core of the ship, and it can move incredibly fast for its size. That's really the only thing that keeps it safe. As for the Colonials, well, how did they respond? Bigger and just giga-dick energy is basically how the Colonials countered this. You see, like we talked about, they have absolutely bonkers amounts of guns. They basically chose to have a number of more flexible systems that would act as support for the main guns. The way that they designed their ships was having a heavily armored prow. The big head at the front of the ship, the thing that makes it look a little bit phallic and for good reason, was the most heavily armored part of the ship. Not only did it contain an absolutely massive number of point defense guns and all the heavy artillery cannons, it was designed that way to block incoming fire. A battlestar would be, shelling a base star, and it would be charging it down at full speed with the engines blaring. And there would be almost no way to actually stop it because the massive armored prow would occlude any line of sight to the flight pods or to the engines or to the more vulnerable rear sections where the jump drive was located or anything like that, right? So if the Cylons wanted to deal damage to the fighter group or to the engines or to any of the support systems, they would have to cross through the unending wall of flak and get behind the Battlestar, while the entire time, that human ship was charging down the main Cylon carrier, firing those massive artillery guns the entire time. So the strategy was incredibly successful, and keep in mind, Battlestars do not operate alone, just like base stars don't. They would operate in massive fleets. It poses a little bit of a problem when you have so much flak going on and, those kinds of explosions and shrapnel do not differentiate. Once Mr. Bomb has left the barrel, he is no longer your friend, regardless of who fired it. There is this really cool system called launch vectoring or launch corridors. And these battle stars, similar to the Cylon Raiders, have like missile tubes that fire the Vipers, their starfighters. And what happens is the point defense guns will very briefly, for like a split second, stop firing and then resume firing, creating a moving bubble of safety within the flak cloud. At the same time, the Vipers will be violently launched out of these tubes to mirror the same speed, that quote-unquote speed, that this safety bubble is moving, and they'll be able to pass through the flak cloud basically untouched to deploy to the outside of it. They can't safely re-enter it because they have to slow down a lot while landing, and that would open a massive hole in their defenses, but the Battlestars can launch their fighters that way. And I think that's just a really, really cool way of getting around the flak screen, at least I think.
History really just does repeat itself, like the old World War I planes firing through I guess World War II as well, firing through the propeller.
Yeah, that's actually a really good analogy of exactly how that works. It's pretty cool.
I can't think of the name of what it was actually called, but
yeah, I can't either. While it's generally not shown since drama and stuff and limited animation budget, The average Battlestar is actually capable of creating that flat cloud that I showed around itself like full 360 if needed, or turbo focusing it in a given direction if that's more important. We only ever see one side since, like I said, they animated it once and just kept, flipping the image whenever they needed to use it for a different scene. The average colonial ship is more than capable of basically just filling every square inch of space around itself with never-ending explosions and shrapnel. It's basically how they deal with missiles and the raider superiority, because the Cylons are going to have to commit an absolutely huge number of resources to get through the flat cloud. And while we're here, let's talk about a few other things. We're going to talk a little bit about the FTL. We're going to talk about like the red line and stuff, what that is, how the engines work. We're going to talk a little bit about finally, we're going to talk about the command navigation program and how humanity royally ate shit at the end of the Second Cylon War. The Second Cylon War lasting a grand total of about 5 hours. Let's talk about the FTL stuff, because big ships jumping across space is really cool. In Star Wars, you're literally just moving yourself faster than the speed of light. In Star Trek, you're creating like a different dimension and you're warping space around you. And in a lot of other sci-fi, it's pretty much the same thing, right? Or there's giant portals or whatever, or like, ring gates that just create a like wormhole from one place to another. In Battlestar Galactica, it's basically like tunneling through a sub-dimension and instantaneously quantum teleporting yourself across the galaxy. And when I say like quantum teleporting yourself, I really do mean that. There is no spool up time. There is basically absolutely no limit on this, and there's no travel time.
Schrodinger's ship moment.
Schrodinger's ship moment? A little bit. It's way cooler. Like we've talked about the BattleTech FTL, how it's also like quantum entanglement for jumping, and it takes them forever to charge and stuff. But in Battlestar Galactica, they use it a lot more creatively, and they have a lot more fun with it, because they basically just went, yeah, we can teleport whenever, wherever. Let's just do it, right? Let's just go nuts with it. So what happens is they have to use a mineral fuel called Tilium. That's what powers the engines. And they need an absolutely enormous amount of it in order to actually jump. It's extremely... Regular ships also use that Tilium as like fuel for their thrusters and stuff in real space, so it's a super valuable resource. But what happens is that Tilium is basically annihilated. Like it dematerialized, reduced to atoms, ceases to exist in order to provide energy to the engine, which will then teleport the ship. And the only limitations on this is something that is colloquially referred to as the red line. The only hard limits in Battlestar Galactica's FTL is how far you're trying to go, like how much fuel you have, and how advanced your computer systems are. Theoretically, if you had infinite power and an infinitely powerful computer, you could teleport yourself literally anywhere. There is no limit. The red line is simply the edge of what is possible. Anywhere further than the red line, and your computer systems are no longer capable of plotting a safe jump. The ship may end up, millions of kilometers off of where it wanted to be. If a fleet is trying to jump together, they may end up completely scattered, which actually does happen once in the show, when the fleet needs to make an emergency jump beyond the red line to get away from the Cylons. But again, it's not really like a hard limit, because theoretically the Galactica can jump way farther than its red line. It just wouldn't really have any control about where it's jumping, and it might accidentally find itself materializing inside of a planet or, next to a sun. So, bit of an oof.
Should be fine. It has enough armor to withstand a planet, it's fine.
I don't think it can withstand being inside a planet, but sure.
Hey, man.
To be fair, it did survive falling through the atmosphere of a planet at well beyond terminal velocity with most of its armor already stripped off. So that the Jupiter class is just a...
What I tell you, they could do it.
That's actually how they use the... Okay, I gotta geek out about this one scene because it's so cool, and I don't understand why more science fiction doesn't do this. So much sci-fi, but what happens is the Galactica needs to free a bunch of people that are being kept hostage on a planet by the Cylons, and what it does is it basically runs the Cylon blockade after tricking them away, right? So it sends a whole bunch of probes off to the other side of the planet. Turbulent weather around it because of the ridiculous air pressure difference. It's so cool. It's like peak science fiction. I love it. It's such a good scene. Unfortunately, humanity... Battlestar Galactica is a post-apocalyptic science fiction universe. Everything that can go wrong has gone wrong in it, and the remnants of humanity are fleeing for their lives, desperately trying to find a new homeland. And the whole point for this is because a dude named Gaius Baltar, both the most punchable character I have ever seen put to screen and one with the stupidest name, created something called the Command Navigation Protocol. And this was a series of extremely advanced programs that would be capable of automating things like Raptor flight and missile lock technology to be able to match the Cylons. However, it would require massive amounts of interlinked computers in order for it to work across an entire battle group. And unfortunately...
Sounds like it's a good idea to implement.
Yeah, it was not a good idea to implement at all. I'm pretty sure you can see where this is coming. Let me give you a hint. 99.999% of humanity didn't exist after it went live. The entire time, remember we talked about humanoid Cylons? Remnants of the 13th colony came back and rediscovered humanity after their own civil war because, remember, history in this universe seems to be on permanent repeat. And those humanoid Cylons evolved into full biological creatures, basically, capable of reproduction and stuff. And then they created a slave race of machines that then rebelled against them and rendered their homeworld inhospitable. And they then tried to find their way back to Cobol and the 12 colonies afterwards. They met with the Cylons, they helped them upgrade stuff, and they created new humanoid Cylons called the Hybrids. Those hybrids, or at least one of them, manipulated Gaius Baltar into altering the programming to create a backdoor, and because of this, when the Cylons invaded during the beginning of the Second Cylon War, they basically had a backdoor into every system of all of humanity, now with the Command Navigation Protocol across all the ships, and they simply shut down every single ship. Every Viper, every Raptor, every Battlestar, every battle station, everything. They shut them all down and they vented everything out into space. Then they shut down all of the planetary-based defense systems and all of the defense platforms in low orbit. And they proceeded to nuclear bombard every single one of the